Is Crimea joining NATO? Negotiations have started, and who is leading the negotiations has shaken the whole of Russia. Putin's loyal general Surovikin, who disappeared, has appeared in the Crimean city of Sevastopol. After that, the signal for an unexpected alliance in Crimea came. From the Wagner mercenaries in this region, a large number of names began to move to the more dangerous Krasny-Orel. This is the beginning of the end for Putin. Wagner leader Prigozhin's coup breakthrough has been ignited in Belarus this time too. Prigozhin, who fled to Belarus, came under the patronage of Olezka Kuznetsov. Lukashenko, on the other hand, made a huge mistake in trying to block this rebel initiative. And because of these internal upheavals, the Russian army faced a very big problem against Ukraine. In the last days of Russia, Putin has started to experience some rather complicated problems. These problems in the administration in Russia were due to the fact that a very large audience no longer wanted Putin. Putin has reached a point where he is decently unwelcome among Russians more and more by the day. The main reason for this was the wrong moves he made recently. While the weakness of economic management and the big problems experienced in foreign policy weakened Putin, everything got mixed up with his entry into Ukraine. The masses of the people who are opposed to Putin and many organizations have taken action to overthrow Putin. This move would be the beginning of the end for Putin. With the triggering of these many complicated processes, Wagner first began to take steps for the coup. At the heart of the coup was the fact that the Russian army could no longer be managed correctly. Putin's authority, which has not managed to send even proper supply convoys to Russian soldiers, has been thoroughly shaken by these many moves. On top of this, Prigozhin had repeatedly warned Putin, stating that he had only caused the death of Russian soldiers in this way. But Putin did not heed any of these words, and at last he faced the bitter truth. Prigozhin withdrew his troops first. When Sergei Shoigu bombed Wagner's positions in response, he began to move towards Moscow to stage a coup. After these developments, peace was signed between the parties deck with the intervention of Lukashenko, but it was not known exactly what he promised Prigozhin and why peace was signed. This would actually show us once again how strong Olezka Kuznetsov is. Prigozhin was deported to Belarus immediately after the peace. After that, he contacted Olezka Kuznetsov, who was in that area. Olezka Kuznetsov was exiled from Russia by Putin in 2005. Kuznetsov, who was British on his mother's side, was a former Soviet captain. This British citizenship would also save his life. Kuznetsov had noticed that Putin had gained more power over time and completely disrupted the democratic structure. For this purpose, he began to organize many generals and army members who were brought up in the tradition of the Red Army to take early measures. But this was the period when Putin was at his most powerful. During this period, when the KGB's activity level was at its highest, Kuznetsov was captured directly. Along with him, a large number of his comrades in arms were purged from the army and sentenced to prison. But Kuznetsov, thanks to his British citizenship, was only deported to Belarus. After that, Kuznetsov, who is claimed by many anti-Putin names, has taken a very big step. Kuznetsov founded a mercenary organization in Belarus called Krasny-Orel. Although the resources were insufficient at first, he received a lot of support over time as Putin began to democratize the country. The purpose of this organization was to restore the Soviet Union and take Russia back to the good old days. Kuznetsov, who has been gathering power since 2005, was exposed after Wagner's coup attempt, and he took Prigozhin under his patronage. One of the most important names Kuznetsov grew up with was Sergei Surovikin. Surovikin, who brought him into contact with Prigozhin, would suddenly become one of the most critical figures for Krasny-Orel. And with that, everything started to change. Krasny-Orel was initially snubbed by the Kremlin administration. After that, many of the activities that Krasny-Orel did began to change everything. First, he freed a large number of Wagner soldiers from prisons that Putin had sent into exile in Belarus. This allowed Krasny-Orel to earn the respect of the Wagner soldiers, and the period of deconfliction between organizations has begun. After that, Kuznetsov has now become a very big threat to Putin, and Putin has taken action to make breakthroughs against this. Putin decided to use Lukashenko first. Lukashenko, who wants to completely eliminate the activities of this organization in Belarus, has taken action. But he got a response he never expected. A large number of Belarusians have taken action to support Krasny-Orel, which is highly held among the Belarusian people. Belarusians, after Lukashenko shouted numerous slogans such as resignation, expressed that Krasny-Orel is an important value. After that, Belarusian leader Lukashenko was surprised what to do. Lukashenko, who wanted to take steps to stand up to the protests, faced a very big problem. Some of the law enforcement agencies did not want to intervene in the events. Because Kuznetsov had also incorporated most law enforcement agencies in this region into his own structure. After that, Lukashenko did not know what to do. The most important reason for this is that the number of people who are annoyed with Putin was quite high. The Belarusian people were quite annoyed that Putin interfered so much in the internal affairs of Belarus, and with that, he took to the streets. A large number of Belarusians began to hold demonstrations in many regions. These groups, which are against Putin, have left Lukashenko helpless. And this longing of the people for the Soviet Union has stunned the whole world. After the full support of Krasny-Orel, Lukashenko was forced to back down. One of the most important epicenters of the organization was established in the Belarusian city of Lipel. After that, Putin realized that he could not solve this business, and he decided to meet with a critical country that does not want a Russia that will regain its former power. But the main reason that enabled this has caused a big echo all over the world. Krasny-Orel, which has made intensive breakthroughs in Belarus and Russia, decided to take a bigger step this time. Crimea, which was registered as the last territory to join Russia and is not recognized by any country, was the main target. Opposition groups and Russian citizens in Crimea did not want Putin's dominance in this region. Krasny-Orel, on the other hand, decided to take advantage of it. Kuznetsov, who wanted to create a certain popular structure in Crimea, was now determined to show himself in many areas. That was the main reason why Surovikin appeared in Crimea after the Wagner connection. Surovikin was given the task of directing a possible coup in Crimea. Surovikin, who will organize the people and soldiers in this region, first contacted the Wagner soldiers in the Crimea. The soldiers, who are members of Wagner, contacted the Crimean Fire Group, which continues its activities actively in every region of Crimea, and very large protests were launched in this region. The people started shouting the slogan of freedom to Crimea with torches in their hands. The protesters, who had a dream of creating a new state in Crimea, had a very different idea. The Crimeans who wanted to join Ukraine in the first place had started to change their minds a little more now. Now things were much different. The promises made by Surovikin and Kuznetsov would form the basis for very important breakthroughs, both from a security and economic point of view. But the size of the protests and the incompetence of Putin's law enforcement agencies would change everything. A crisis has been revealed in the Kremlin, because the plan expressed by the Crimeans would be the basis for everything to change. The greatest desire of the Crimean people was now to get rid of Putin's freak system of rule. The Crimean people, who supported the Ukrainian army from the very beginning, were demanding that freedom be given directly to their country. However, a large number of countries have also begun to support the minority in Crimea. Although he deconstructed a new country among the predictions, the recognition of Crimea and its ability to be protected against Putin were of great importance. While the Crimean people were considering the steps to be taken against Putin, they were also faced with many difficulties. Especially considering Putin's sanctions in many areas, a solid force was needed for this. However, the Crimean people have started negotiations with the United States. In a possible declaration of independence, it was learned that the United States is looking warmly at the NATO issue. In this analogy, Crimea would become the Cuba of the United States, and he would allow him to make any moves he wanted in the Black Sea. Putin faced a very big problem for these reasons, and without knowing what to do, he directed all the law enforcement agencies he had to this area. As a result of Krasny-Orel's uprising of the people, Putin's problems with domination were revealed once again. It was known that Putin, who could not even regulate the course of the regional government in Crimea, was looking for a different remedy. But the main problem was something else. Krasny-Ural, which wants to create an alternative to Russia by shaking its own authority, had become active in many areas. Because of this, it was detected by Ukrainian army agents that Putin had started working for some negotiations. And at this point, an unexpected move came from Putin. Realizing that Crimea would go out of hand and that he could not fight with a region that would turn into an anti-Putin formation, Putin began to make different breakthroughs. But the organization was quite deep-rooted. Putin took action after many anti-formations, such as the Russian Freedom Legion, which are completely thinking about the interests of Russia, also announced their support for these moves. And he made an unexpected move. If Krasny-Ural became a little stronger, it seemed possible that the dream of the Soviet Union would come true. The management plan of Kuznetsov, who has taken firm steps against Putin in many areas, was leaked by Wagner members who wanted to be forgiven. Kuznetsov, after taking over, would himself move to the position where Putin is now. Immediately after that, he was going to make Prigozhin, who is currently with him, the Minister of Defense, bypassing the order. At the same time, it is being discussed that Sergei Surovikin will also become chief of the general staff. So Kuznetsov is coming to take over the administration with a solid staff. The important steps Kuznetsov has taken recently have actually revealed how big an organization Krasny-Ural is, thanks to the large number of high-ranking soldiers and the number of officials in the state. Krasny-Ural has the opportunity to follow every step taken by Putin in Russia. Krasny-Ural, who has been at the forefront of all operations against Putin, is now taking action to turn things in his favor. In the latest information that has emerged, Krasny-Ural's numerous moves, such as laying explosives under the Moscow bridge with the claim of assassinating Putin and seizing nuclear warheads during the Wagner coup, also stand out. After Putin's failures against the Ukrainian army were brought up, Putin started working on a different plan, and this plan had the quality to change everything. Recently, the news that Putin had held a secret meeting with the United States shocked the whole world. Although the reason for this has not yet been announced, it was noted that Putin gathered all the senior bureaucrats after the meeting, held a meeting of about 9 hours, and left the Kremlin without making a statement to the media. The fact that this time came to us just at the time when Krasny-Ural activities were increasing clarified many issues. After that, the rumor spread in this region that Putin wanted help from the United States, because there was a very high probability that the United States would stand against an organization that could restore the Soviet Union. But what he wanted in return was a matter of great curiosity. While it is expected that Putin will ask Ukraine to withdraw, a very big crossroads awaits Putin. He will choose either his power or the Ukrainian dream. And with that, things will literally get mixed up. Putin will completely lose the vote of public trust if he fails to invade Ukraine. If he does not withdraw, it is also impossible to finish Krasny-Ural without the support of the United States. Because of this, very troubled hours come back-to-back in the Kremlin, and everything has been confused by the reaction of a large number of lawmakers who are also against Putin. Since the Ukrainian army managed to take the lead in many areas, it was aware of the events breaking out inside Russia during this process. Because of this, he decided to organize an operation immediately. It is not known exactly what Russia will do behind these steps taken to squeeze Putin, who is already being clamped down on in every sense, into a corner more. And with that, many things are expected to get worse. But this operation organized by Ukraine with the intensive intelligence gathered will completely change the course of everything. And in Donetsk, Putin's complete desperation behind these latest developments has completely confused things. The Ukrainian army has detected unmanned aerial vehicles in its possession, using the superiority it has established against the Russians in many regions. The purpose of these unmanned aerial vehicles was to detect the location of all headquarters in that region. As a result of the mapping of these headquarters in the Donetsk region by observation from above, the Ukrainian army began preparations for action. But at this point, there was a very important security vulnerability that Ukraine realized. The Ukrainian army had thought that it could also carry out an attack with unmanned aerial vehicles before advancing towards Russian positions, because there was nothing in that area that could protect from these missile firings. The Russian soldiers were not aware of this, and the number of those who had recently been affected by the rebellion of Krasnoyarsk and Wagner was high within the army. For this, they literally had a hard time adapting to war again. They also did not know that there were no S-400s in the area, so they were just standing guard in a very drowsy situation. Because of this, the Ukrainian army moved to organize a comfortable operation. The Ukrainian army, which mobilized the tanks and armored vehicles it had in order to move towards the Russians, immediately began preparations. The Ukrainian army, which wanted to cause very severe damage to the headquarters, decided to use tanks that had a high level of strength that it received from the United States and Germany. Due to the fact that their damage potential was more than necessary, the Ukrainian army began to prove that it would take the lead in the region, and he began to move towards the headquarters that he had determined to land the strongest blow. The Ukrainian army, which directed the most powerful tanks it had in its possession to this region, waited for the right time. We approached the Russian headquarters and then came to one of the most important points. At this point, the Ukrainian army surrounded one of the westernmost military headquarters of the Russians. The Russian soldiers did not notice the incident until they were blockaded. The Ukrainian army had deployed its tanks to surround the Russian headquarters, and he called for surrender. But while Ukraine was making this call, it turned out why the Russian soldiers could not notice the tanks. The people had started a huge uprising in Donetsk, and the Russian soldiers were surprised at what they suffered with the call to surrender. Russian soldiers looked at Ukrainian troops from the top of the headquarters. They realized that Ukraine, which was outnumbered, was going to take over this military headquarters. A group of soldiers at the headquarters directly laid down their weapons. Other groups were deployed to engage in the conflict. When shots were fired at the Ukrainian army, Ukraine also took action to respond, and he took a very big step against the Russians. Using the advantage of the headquarters, the Russian soldiers were making a very successful defense. After the interception of radios by the Ukrainian army, the Russians faced a bigger problem. But the Russian soldiers who continued to defend themselves were once again called to surrender. The Ukrainian army has started using tanks as a deterrent behind this. And taking a much bigger step against the Russians, he at once fired at the walls of the headquarters. The outer wall of the headquarters was destroyed due to the fact that the Abrams shells were reinforced with uranium. After that, all Russian soldiers surrendered, and the Ukrainian army won a very important victory. This has started to collect reactions back-to-back in many regions, because Putin's most important promise had been completely destroyed. After these developments, there were some very tense moments in the Russian parliament. There was a lost war against Ukraine and a huge economic pile-up. Deputies, who are also representatives of the people, began to react to this situation. There was a very heavy reaction from pro-government opposition deputies who shouted Putin resignation slogans in the parliament. As a result of this, things got completely mixed up. Russia is almost divided in two, and Putin began to break out into a cold sweat over this news. After that, the events that unfolded in Donetsk turned everything completely against Putin. Russian and Ukrainian citizens united and joined the Free Donetsk organization. The patience of Russian citizens forced to live on the territory of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin has overflowed. Russian citizens who were resettled in the regions annexed by the Russian army on the territory of Ukraine have been banned by Putin from returning to Russia. Russian citizens who could not return to Russia united with the Ukrainian people and started a big rebellion. Russian citizens have started to join the Free Donetsk organization, known as the Pro-Ukrainian Resistance Organization in the Donetsk region. Having difficulty suppressing the attempts of rebellion here, Putin has decided to send thousands of Russian National Guards to the Donetsk region. Putin, who declared a state of emergency in Donetsk with the growth of the rebellion, suffered a big blow from his own citizens. The Russian dominance in Donetsk, one of the regions first occupied by the Russian army, is still continuing. The Ukrainian army is continuing its operations at full speed to regain control of regions such as Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Luhansk, which were annexed by Putin. As it is known, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has organized illegal referendums in these regions to show that these territories he has occupied now belong to Russia. Although Putin stated that he annexed these 4 regions, Putin's decision to annex this annexation was not accepted by almost any country. The illegal referendum that Putin held in these regions took place under the control of the Russian military. Ukrainian citizens who were forced to vote at gunpoint had to use their votes openly. When Vladimir Putin's annexation decisions were not approved by other states, Putin put his secret plan into operation. After Putin annexed these regions, he began sending tens of thousands of Russian citizens to these cities. Russian citizens agreed to live in these occupied cities with various promises. Vladimir Putin's main goal here is to ensure a plurality of votes by holding a legal referendum in these 4 cities when the war ends. This plan of Putin, who thinks of winning the referendum, results with the votes of the Russian citizens he's settled in these cities, has caused a big explosion. This irrational strategy of Vladimir Putin has been progressing smoothly so far, but due to the internal turmoil occurring within the borders of Russia, a big problem has arisen in the plan. The fact that Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin attempted a coup in Russia has put Putin in an even more difficult situation. The Ukrainian army has started organizing air operations against the Donetsk region, turning these internal disturbances experienced in Russia into an opportunity. The Ukrainian army, which carried out air operations on 2 different Russian headquarters located in Donetsk, scared the Russian citizens living in the region quite a lot. Russian citizens, realizing that the war has again spilled over into the Donetsk borders, began to become quite agitated. The last point that overflowed the patience of the Russian people was that Vladimir Putin began to break his promises to these citizens. Russian citizens, who did not have any livelihoods in the Donetsk region, were financially supported by the Russian government. All Russian citizens resettled here were given lands, houses from the Donetsk region, and were paid a large amount. However, with the Russian economy entering a turbulent period and the money in the state treasury decreasing, Putin began to be unable to pay these people properly. This situation was very annoying for Russian citizens, but the point that overwhelmed the patience of these people was the Ukrainian army's air operation in the Donetsk region. Ukrainian forces carried out an attack with long-range missiles on a Russian ammunition depot located in the city center of Donetsk, and as a result of the attack, a large explosion occurred at the ammunition depot. With the effect of the explosion, the flames reaching meters high caused the citizens of the region to be afraid. Immediately after this incident, the Ukrainian army moved one step closer to Donetsk, with the operation launched against the city of Kramatorsk, which is quite close to the Donetsk region. This operation of the Ukrainian army, which managed to capture the command center of the Russian army in the city of Kramatorsk, has become a big agenda all over the world. At the same time, the Ukrainian army conducted an operation with unmanned combat aircraft on a military headquarters in the city of Makivka, located near the city center of Donetsk, managed to intimidate the Russian forces with successive deconfliction operations. It was announced by the Ukrainian authorities that 347 Russian soldiers lost their lives thanks to these operations organized by the Ukrainian army within 2 days. However, the most interesting event was the reaction of Russian citizens living in the region as a result of these operations carried out by the Ukrainian army. Noticing that the Ukrainian army was approaching the city center, Russian citizens began to think that they had been deceived by Putin. Russian citizens, aware that Vladimir Putin has failed to ensure the security of the Donetsk region and that the Ukrainian army will soon enter the city, have completely lost faith in Putin. After the internal turmoil in Russia, these citizens, realizing that Putin did not think about them, began to organize protests by taking to the streets of Donetsk. While anti-Putin and anti-war protests were held in the streets, hundreds of Russian citizens also began to leave the Donetsk region. These citizens, who thought that they could leave the city and return to the borders of Russia, were quite wrong about this. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has already banned the return of these citizens he sent to Ukraine. Russian border guard soldiers formed a large line on the Russian borders, preventing Russian citizens trying to return from entering the country. Russian citizens who stayed at the border gate and were not allowed in began attacking the border guard soldiers with stones after a while. Border guard teams managed to disperse the crowd formed at the border crossing by opening fire in the air with weapons. But Putin's refusal to let his own citizens into Russia has led to the rebellion in the Donetsk region reaching a very different dimension. The protests organized by Russian citizens on the streets of Donetsk suddenly turned into a major riot. However, the most interesting thing is that Ukrainian citizens living in the region also supported this rebellion. The indigenous people of Donetsk joined this rebellion started by Russian citizens and started marching on the Russian soldiers with torches and sticks in their hands. Russian soldiers, unable to shoot at their own citizens, could do nothing but blockade the area. After a while, Russian and Ukrainian citizens surrounded the building of the Donetsk regional governor appointed by Vladimir Putin and began throwing stones at the building where the governor was located. Unable to leave the building, the Donetsk regional governor declared a state of emergency and requested support from the Russian government. The soldiers of the Free Donetsk organization, who suddenly appeared while this rebellion was going on in the streets, gave a great support to this rebellion started by the people of the region. This organization, known for carrying out sabotage actions against ammunition depots and headquarters of the Russian army in the Donetsk region, has been operating in Donetsk since the beginning of the war. This resistance organization, consisting of pro-Ukrainian former soldiers and citizens of the region, has taken action to turn this uprising in Donetsk into an opportunity. With the growth of the rebellion, Russian soldiers began to use brute force in order to prevent their citizens from entering the building where the Donetsk regional governor is located. The soldiers of the Free Donetsk Resistance Organization opposed these harsh interventions of the Russian soldiers and began to neutralize the Russian soldiers stationed in the region. The members of the organization, who protect Russian citizens from Russian soldiers, managed to win the respect of rebellious Russian citizens. With the growth of the rebellion and the fact that Russian citizens began to join this organization, there was a great panic in the Kremlin palace. The chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, gave orders for the withdrawal of Russian troops stationed in the region. Immediately afterwards, he made a tactical plan to ensure the control of the region again. Gerasimov began sending the Russian National Guard, known as Rosgvardia, stationed within the borders of Russia to the Donetsk region, and sent thousands of National Guard soldiers to the territory of Donetsk. However, Gerasimov was quite late in doing this. Russian citizens who started a rebellion and Ukrainian citizens who supported this rebellion began to join the Free Donetsk organization in order to show their anger at Vladimir Putin. Actions were taken to send more weapons and ammunition to this organization, which was armed with the support of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers stationed in the Donetsk region gave the vast majority of the weapons and ammunition found in their headquarters to the Free Donetsk organization. The leader of the resistance organization asked them to support themselves by giving these weapons and ammunition to Russian citizens. Thus, Russian and Ukrainian citizens united, and a much larger organization was established opposite the Russian army. The fact that Russian citizens were not allowed to cross the borders of Russia by Putin caused the anger of Putin among these people to increase even more. The Russian soldiers who left the area issued a warning to the soldiers of the Russian National Guard sent by Putin. Russian soldiers, who stated that Russian citizens living in the region had joined the Free Donetsk organization, warned National Guard soldiers that Russian citizens were armed. The soldiers of the Russian National Guard, who advanced to the Donetsk border entrance, encountered something they never expected here. The Free Donetsk insurgents had prepared to block the entry of National Guard soldiers into the area by creating large-scale defense lines at the entrance of the city. The insurgents, who were deployed to the abandoned buildings at the entrance of the city, managed to block the entrance of the Russian guards to the city. After hours of clashes between the Russian guards and the insurgents, the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, decried the decision to withdraw the National Guard soldiers Acknowledging that the Donetsk region has been lost, Putin made it clear that citizens here will no longer be able to enter Russia's borders forever. This incident in the Donetsk region has become a big agenda all over the world. After this incident, the statement made by the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin managed to shock everyone. The U.S. administration, which has been providing military equipment support to the Ukrainian army since the beginning of the war, announced that support will be provided to a resistance organization for the first time. Minister of Defense Lloyd Austin expressed his gratitude to the members of the Free Donetsk organization, who played a major role in the liberation of the Donetsk region, and expressed that they would do their best to support this organization militarily. Thus, it was officially announced that the Donetsk region was restored to the Ukrainian administration. The Donetsk region, which has been under Russian occupation for a long time, has come back under the control of Ukraine thanks to the Free Donetsk organization and the people of the region. However, some border towns of Donetsk were still under the control of the Russian army. The capture of the Donetsk region has created a great opportunity for the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers have conducted large-scale ground operations to capture Russian-occupied border towns. The Ukrainian authorities, aware that the Russian army was in a weak period due to internal disturbances in Russia, were aware that they could completely capture the Donetsk Oblast. Thus, the Ukrainian army launched an operation against the town of Volnovakha, which has been under Russian occupation for a long time and is located on the border with Donetsk. The Ukrainian army, mobilizing from the cities of Lyman and Izyum, which have been under the control of the Ukrainian army for a long time, began to advance towards the Volnovakha region with a large battalion. Realizing that the Russian army was losing their numerical superiority with the withdrawal of Wagner troops, the Ukrainian troop commanders wanted to quickly enter the town. The Ukrainian army, which managed to overcome the defense line formed by Russian soldiers on the border of the town within hours, successfully entered the town. The Ukrainian soldiers who entered the town continued the clashes inside the town. The fact that the Russian soldiers were outnumbered made it possible for this operation organized by the Ukrainian army to succeed very easily. Unable to resist the Ukrainian army's offensive any longer, the Russian forces began a rapid retreat from the town. The Russian flag in the town was lowered by the Ukrainian commander personally, and the Ukrainian flag was hung instead. These three operations organized by the Ukrainian army within a week led to the loss of many Russian soldiers' lives. Putin, who is losing hundreds of soldiers every day, is now having great difficulty finding soldiers for the army. But Putin has much bigger problems than finding troops. As the news of the Russian soldiers who lost their lives as a result of these operations, organized by the Ukrainian army, spread in Russia, Russian citizens began to organize protests again. The Russian people do not want to lose any more troops on the territory of Ukraine anymore. This war, which has been going on for 17 months, continues to drag Russia towards a major disaster. Aware of this, Russian citizens began to gather in front of the Kremlin palace and wanted to organize protests with anti-Putin and anti-war rhetoric. The protesters, whose numbers soon reached 1,000, think that Putin does not value his own soldiers. Russian leader Vladimir Putin quickly deployed Russian security forces in an attempt to prevent these protests from leading to greater consequences. The Russian security forces, which have full authority due to the previous protests, used all means to disperse the Russian citizens gathered in front of the Kremlin palace. After a while, a brawl began to take place between the Russian people and the Russian police. Decree: a large majority of the demonstrators were detained by Russian security forces. At the same time, Russian citizens, including alleged Wagner supporters, were jailed. Putin's aggressive behavior towards his own people has created a big agenda in Russia. Russian citizens have collected signatures for Putin's resignation, with signature campaigns launched via social media platforms. The Russian leader finally made a statement about this issue, but again did not accept responsibility. Putin, who stated that all of these demonstrators gathered in front of the Kremlin palace were Wagner-supporting coup plotters, tried to manipulate Russian citizens by stating that Russia's internal peace would be disturbed if they did not intervene. Vladimir Putin, while trying to fight both with his own citizens, is forced to fight with resistance organizations within the borders of Russia on the one hand. After this action by the Free Donetsk organization insurgents, the insurgents in Crimea began to manifest themselves again. From the first months of the war, pro-Ukrainian Crimean insurgents, who were engaged in sabotage attempts against Russian forces in Crimea, became one of Vladimir Putin's greatest fears. The Crimean Fire Group insurgents, whose name we often hear, have organized many sabotages against Russian soldiers. The insurgents who managed to neutralize 3 Russian officers serving in Crimea in recent months have become an issue on the agenda all over the world. Insurgents who destroyed the vehicles of Russian officers with a portable rocket launcher missile led to the loss of 3 officers' lives. Shortly after this incident, it made the supply routes from Crimea to Ukraine unusable in order to prevent Russian soldiers from arranging military shipments to Ukrainian territory. The insurgents, who placed explosives on the land routes most frequently used by the Russian military and made them unusable, dealt one of their biggest blows to Putin. Now, the insurgents of the Crimean Fire Group organization, who became even more emboldened after the rebellion launched by the Free Donetsk organization, have also started a major rebellion on the territory of Crimea. With the Wagner army beginning to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, Vladimir Putin began to send more Russian troops to Ukraine. Putin, who does not want to give back the occupied territories on the territory of Ukraine, is starting to increase the number of troops in these regions. At the same time, more weapons and ammunition were needed for these new soldiers who were sent. As it is known, the vast majority of weapons and ammunition sent to Russian troops on the territory of Ukraine are sent through Crimea. For this reason, there are ammunition depots in the Russian army headquarters in Crimea. Crimean insurgents managed to blow up one of these ammunition depots. Realizing that the Russian army has begun to carry out new shipments of ammunition to Ukraine, Crimean insurgents have located one of the warehouses where these munitions were received. The insurgents, who mobilized late at night in 2 groups, would advance towards the Russian headquarters. The first group cut the wires surrounding the headquarters and entered while the other group was observing the environment. The insurgents, who managed to approach the ammunition depot without being visible to the Russian soldiers inside the headquarters, placed the timed plastic explosives they had brought with them in the ammunition depot. Then they quickly left the headquarters. With the placed explosives becoming active within minutes, a large explosion occurred at the ammunition depot. With the activation of the ammunition in the warehouse, the intensity of the explosion reached a fairly large size. With the impact of the explosion, the darkness of the night was replaced by light. While the Russian soldiers stationed at the headquarters were surprised at what had happened, the Russian troop commander quickly decided to evacuate the headquarters. While hundreds of Russian soldiers stationed at the headquarters quickly left the headquarters, they still could not understand why the explosion occurred. The Russian soldiers, who at first thought this explosion was an airstrike, later realized that it was a major sabotage. Crimean fire brigades took action to extinguish the flames caused by the explosion. Although 6 fire trucks arrived around the headquarters, the ammunition in the ammunition depot was still exploding under the influence of the flames. For this reason, fire crews could not intervene in the burning ammunition depot. Tons of ammunition were destroyed in front of the Russian commander's eyes. This explosion that occurred was the biggest activity that the Crimean insurgents had done so far. The explosion of one of the largest ammunition depots of the Russian army caused a great panic in the Kremlin palace. Putin has asked for more Russian troops to be sent to the headquarters here in order to ensure the security of the Russian headquarters in Crimea. At Putin's request, Russian General Valery Gerasimov sent thousands of Russian troops to the territory of Crimea. Although it is known that this explosion in Crimea was carried out by Crimean insurgents, Russian leader Vladimir Putin stated that this explosion occurred as a result of an accident. Denying the allegations that this explosion was sabotage, Putin stated that the reason for this explosion was caused by the activation of one of the explosives in the ammunition depot. In addition, this explosion was advertised in this way on all Russian national channels. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has previously said that explosions that occurred within the borders of Russia occurred as a result of an accident. Putin, who has been trying to suppress his own people by manipulating them since the beginning of the war, thinks that he can get public support by playing the role of a victim. But the Russian people, the fact that Vladimir Putin started a war with a decision he made alone, has made the Russian people even angrier. According to many expert researchers, the main reason Vladimir Putin started this war is that he wants to be re-elected as president of Russia in the next elections. Putin, who drove the people into fear and panic by starting a new war, thought that the Russian people would need him. But in this, he was quite wrong. After the partial mobilization decision taken in Russia, the Russian people's view of Putin has changed quite a lot. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens were forced to leave their territory due to Putin's decision to mobilize. Worst of all, Russian citizens who had no possibility to leave the country were forcibly conscripted into the army and sent to their deaths on Ukrainian soil. The biggest reason why the Russian army lost about 250,000 soldiers is these new soldiers who were included in the army by the decision of partial mobilization. Despite the lack of combat experience, these soldiers who were sent to fight in Ukraine after a very short training are not resistant to combat conditions. In the face of back-to-back riots, Putin was surprised what to do. After Donetsk, popular uprisings broke out all over Russia. The offensive of the Ukrainian army, who knew this opportunity, turned the whole world into a joke. In the face of this preposterous attack by Ukraine, the Russian army is cornered. In the face of the power shown by the Ukrainian army in the air, on land and at sea, Putin's power has come to the brink of collapse. Ukraine's ingenious move has changed all the balances in the war. In the last days of the Ukrainian war, Russian President Vladimir Putin is experiencing the most difficult days of his career. The most important reason for this was the spread of the popular uprisings that started in Donetsk to the whole of Russia. Putin's conduct of a wrong foreign policy throughout the war has isolated Russia among the world's states. After that, the sanctions of the United States and other Western countries eventually dragged the Russian economy into a major crisis. And the reaction of the Russian people, desperate in the face of inflation, to Russian leader Vladimir Putin has increased every day. The first place of these reactions was Donetsk, and the riots that started in Donetsk soon spread throughout Russia. Aware of this situation, the Ukrainian army has started preparing the biggest offensive plan in its history. In the face of the growing riots in Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin has begun to take extraordinary measures. The most notable of these measures was the transfer of many air defense systems on the Ukrainian fronts to Moscow. And many S-300 and S-400 air defense systems tasked with blocking the Ukrainian army's air operations have been deployed in Moscow. But the intensive work of the Ukrainian intelligence service revealed Putin's move. With this step, any Russian threat to the Ukrainian army's air operations has been eliminated. Having decided to use this to the advantage of his own army, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held emergency meetings with senior commanders in the army. However, these preparations of the Ukrainian army were not limited to the air operation, but went down in history as the biggest blow to the Russian forces. Since the first days of the war, Ukraine has shown a great superiority over the Russians in ground operations. The biggest reason for this was the US and Western support coming to Ukraine. As these supports continued to increase, Ukraine, whose army inventory was greatly expanded, repulsed the invading Russian forces behind the front. Ukraine, which is increasing the size of these ground operations every day, has chosen Donetsk, a very critical region for its new operation. The Ukrainian army, which aims to launch an all-out offensive here, has started sending many tanks and armored vehicles to the region. The building blocks of this shipment were American M1 Abrams tanks and Leopard 2S, whose barrels were reinforced with uranium. The effective use of these tanks has brought great victories to Ukraine since the moment they were transferred to the Ukrainian army inventory. This is based on the shooting power of the American-made Abrams and the impenetrable armor of the Leopard 2S, and Ukraine gained a great advantage by sending these tanks for the largest ground offensive to take place in Donetsk. The Ukrainian army approaching the region began to wait off Donetsk. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian intelligence service has received a very important piece of information. Thanks to this information, it was determined that the Russian army had established a large headquarters on the eastern line of Donetsk. After that, the location where the Ukrainian army will make the attack was definitely determined. But just at this time, Ukraine took a mind-boggling decision. The capture of the headquarters in Donetsk was of critical importance. And during the all-out offensive to be organized in the region, the Ukrainian army shipped a large part of its inventory to this region. If this offensive had failed, Ukraine could have suffered a major casualty. Seeking to prevent this, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held talks with the naval forces. At the end of these negotiations, the Ukrainian Navy was diverted to the Crimean coast, and Ukrainian ships arriving in the region began firing missiles at the port of Sevastopol. Surprised by what he suffered in the face of this missile attack, Putin sent many troops to Crimea in order not to lose his dominance of the region. Some of the Russian soldiers in Donetsk also participated in this shipment, and so the Ukrainian army took the first step of its biggest offensive throughout the war. According to information provided by Ukrainian intelligence, all Russian air defense systems in Donetsk had been moved to Moscow. Knowing this opportunity, the Ukrainian army activated unmanned aerial vehicles in the operation against Karagah, and one after another, Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aircraft were sent to the region. These Ukrainian UAVs rained bombs on the Russian headquarters in the south of Donetsk back-to-back. In the face of this bombardment, the Russian soldiers around the headquarters were surprised at what they suffered. Seeing these Russian soldiers fleeing to the headquarters, the Ukrainian ground forces mobilized. At this time, the Flag Tazlar continued to drop bombs, causing very heavy damage to the headquarters. While these shots were being fired decently, the Russian soldiers encountered a second surprise, and knowing the opportunity of the confusion that broke out inside the headquarters, Ukrainian tank troops began to hit the Russian headquarters. However, the T-72 Russian tanks in the region were insufficient in the face of the Ukrainian army. These T-72s could not even penetrate the armor of the Leopard 2 German tanks in the hands of the Ukrainian army. And the Abrams, positioned behind the Leopard 2s, continued to hit the headquarters. After that, heavy shots from Leopard Abrams M1 American tanks destroyed the western wing of the headquarters in a short time. However, the Ukrainian army continued to advance, targeting T-72 Russian tanks. When the Russian soldiers saw that the T-72 tanks were destroyed by a single shot from the Abrams, they were surprised what to do. In the face of this ingenious operation, the Ukrainian army, which gave the Russians a nightmare, immediately blockaded the headquarters, and the Russian soldiers trapped inside the building were demanded to surrender. 20 Russian soldiers came out of the headquarters to surrender to Ukrainian forces one after the other. In the face of this wonderful offensive of the Ukrainian army, Putin went mad with anger. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is already trying to prevent Russian uprisings in many regions, has lost one of his most critical headquarters. As a result of hearing this news in a short time in Russia, public reactions grew like an avalanche. As a result of the Ukrainian offensive, which caused a major crisis in the Kremlin, Putin's power suffered another heavy blow. After the news of the victory, which was celebrated with great enthusiasm in Ukraine, the Ukrainian army continued to advance along the Donetsk line without slowing down at all. This all-out offensive has greatly increased Ukraine's dominance in the region, and the recent operations of Ukraine, which was in a more defensive position in the early days of the war, have completely changed direction. With this latest offensive, Ukraine has now proved that it is also engaged in offensive moves. The biggest reason for this was the incoming supports. During the first period of the war, defense equipment formed the content of the support packages offered by the United States and other Western countries to Ukraine. However, as a result of the recent successful offensive operations of the Ukrainian army, the Western support packages have taken on an offensive-oriented structure, and with the Abrams and Leopard 2s entering the inventory of the Ukrainian army, Ukraine continued its progress on land. In addition, the Ukrainian army, which has strengthened the strength of its air force with Turkish-made Bayraktar unmanned combat aircraft and Storm Shadow British missiles, has begun an October offensive. The comments of war analysts about this offensive were on the agenda of the whole world. According to war analysts, Ukraine's successful foreign policies since the beginning of the war will change everything. And the support packages that the United States and other Western countries have sent to Ukraine since the beginning of the war can lead the Ukrainian army to absolute victory. One of the biggest reasons for this was that Putin was completely alone in foreign policy as a result of his wrong moves. The threats made by Russian President Vladimir Putin have caused him to confront the whole world. However, as a result of the sanctions against Putin, Russia has been dragged into a major crisis. The most important point on which this crisis was reflected was the economy. And in the face of the Russian economy, which is shrinking every day, the people have become unsure of what to do. The Russian people, who have become unable to withstand the inflation caused by this crisis, have begun to revolt in many places. The riots, first seen in Donetsk, soon broke out all over Russia, and claims that Russian President Vladimir Putin will lose power if these riots continue have started to be talked about all over the world. In such a crisis, Putin's moves, which have taken major blows both on the front line and at the country's borders, have surprised everyone. And in many regions of Russia, special units known for their closeness to Putin began to take up duties. Reactions to Putin, who wants to end the riots with the practices of these units, are growing. On top of this, the intensive censorship efforts in the media have made the public very angry. However, Vladimir Putin has expanded the content of censorship laws to block all possible threats to his loss of power out of hand. With the entry into force of these laws and the implementation of law enforcement agencies sent to the region, Putin wants to prevent riots. However, in the face of the riots, which have grown even bigger with the news from the front, the chances of Putin's power moving have greatly decreased, and it seems likely that at the end of this process, Putin will leave office.